I want to ask you about this nuclear question because in your book you describe in chilling detail moments where the procedures that are supposed to provide a bulwark against an accidental nuclear launch have been flawed. You write about the strategic posture of mutually assured destruction and how politically it has caused a ramping up of weaponry because of presumptions that are being made about the psychology and the strategic choices of the other side, with a potentially destructive tail on it. And now, with the conversation around the no-fly zone, blessedly, the Biden administration has been trying to put the kibosh on that. But there's this appetite among the public for this thing, which they don't really understand would mean a direct conflict with another nuclear power. And what has been frustrating to me is to listen to some of the conversations about the possibility of this kind of a conflict that are increasingly, kind of very cavalier about what that would mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, it's something, it's not a novel thing to say, but it's certainly very important how people have kind of forgotten about nuclear war. If you think about it, I mean, I think the largest demonstration still that ever occurred in the history of New York City was in 1981, I think. We had 1 million people in Central Park demonstrating for a nuclear freeze. People were really concerned at that time and thought a lot about it. And you had, TV, there was a thing called The Day After. That was it was a thing. It was in the culture, thinking about nuclear weapons. Now, that's, as you say, I mean, with these sort of lunatic demands for no-fly zones and so forth, it's gone away. And I would say it's particularly, there's one aspect to this, which is that there's been a very deliberate attempt, I think, by the military to make it more fuzzy. I mean, in the old days, you had our nuclear forces, the Strategic Air Command and all the missiles, and then thousands of tactical nuclear missiles in Europe. But there was supposed to be or at least in people's minds, there was a break between conventional war, not so bad, and nuclear war, terrible. The way the military policy has been evolving is that's become blurred. I notice now the catchphrase among the military master. I mean the nuclear generals like Admiral Richard, who's in charge of Stratcom, in charge of all the nuclear weapons. He was talking on the Hill just a few days ago about integrated deterrence, and they all, if you talk to them, that's the catchphrase of today: integrated deterrence. And what that means is, we've got nuclear is less and less separate from everything else we do anymore. So the line is blurred. They talked about, nuclear maybe, and cyber, and, non-nuclear strike and all that. So it's all getting meshed together into one command and control system, which I think is hair-raising, because what it means is, that they suddenly, this thing, this particular policy of using a non-nuclear thing, well, that's not working so well. So it makes it much easier to go to the next step. Well, maybe we'll use a little nuclear weapon just to send a signal to whoever it is, the Russians or the Chinese. And as part of that, that's been a good excuse for developing, spending a lot of money on building, what they call sort of mini nukes, things that only, a third of a kiloton, only the equivalent of only 300 tons of TNT, which would still be the most massive explosion ever. But that's somehow okay. It's like these are all, to my mind, baby steps to nuclear war. And that's what I find so frightening and so little discussed today, of how nuclear war has become sort of more palatable and it's faded into the background.
See, this is the thing for me as we talk about what is to be done in this moment, what the left should be advocating for in terms of Biden's policy. It seems to me that there's a gap between what is to me an intolerable option, the intolerableness of the nuclear option and the way the discussions unfold. So it seems to be very flat. Like there's obviously going to have to be some negotiated solution, some political solution that is going to require some give and take. What did they say about compromise negotiation? It's not a good one unless both sides feel screwed over, right?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, if the things that get put on the table are options like conceding Eastern Ukraine, affirming that there will be no more NATO expansion, disbanding NATO. I mean, there's all kinds of things that people bring up. And I've observed there's a real reluctance to, quote unquote, give in anything to Putin because that's perceived as weakness. It's perceived as validating his actions in this moment. But from my perspective, the alternative is a level of escalation that could lead to this point where we are again talking about nukes, mini nukes, just the tip of the nuke to see if we like it. This kind of ridiculousness. And I wonder how you look at this equation and what you might advise if you were in the position to be Biden's advisor instead of all of Victoria Nuland and Lloyd Austin and all of these warmongers.
Well, I think, it seems to be obvious that there has to be, quite even short of all the very possible sort of consequences of the escalation continues that you go through. I mean, we're looking at the destruction of Ukraine due to this, what the Russians are doing, and a disaster that goes well beyond Ukraine. By the way, the whole, the global economic war that's now being waged against Russia, which will have terrible knock-on effects, like I think the Middle East is going to be without wheat. They're not able to do the Russian exports are cut off. The Ukrainians can't export.
Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. And what is it? Ukraine and Russia combined make how much of the world's wheat?
Oh God, it's like a third. And something equivalent of corn. And Syria lives on that. Egypt lives on that. Iraq lives on that. Many other, Bangladesh, I think. I'm not sure about Bangladesh. Anyway, so there's all that. So this has to stop. It must stop. And okay, we don't want to give Putin anything, but something has to be done. And if there's a possibility, I mean, his demand is if I understand it right, he's come down from his claim that the whole government of Ukraine has to disappear, and the rumors, I mean, if they're true, is that he'll settle for neutrality in Ukraine and hanging on, to Crimea and the separatist republics. Well, I mean, it's galling to give him anything at all, obviously, but I think we should probably go for that. I mean, because, otherwise we're going to fight the last Ukrainian and the last Syrian and the last Egyptian and all the rest and all this, because make no mistake, this whole, as I say, the economic war is going to have terrible effects here, bad recession at the least, I think, and, even worse for many parts of the third world. So I would go for that.
It's difficult because when you say something like that, which I think is kind of the obvious ethical conclusion, people push back saying, well, what about the Ukrainians? You have all of these pictures floating around, which has an interesting racial subtext to it, but I won't get into that right now, where all these, little kids that quote unquote look like us are obviously in this horrible situation, the horrible cover of the New York Times a few days ago with the dead family. Like, it's horrible. And people are like, well, what are we supposed to do? Let this happen. And there is this cognitive dissonance that doesn't recognize that continuing the conflict creates more of that. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's not a war that's being fought out in a Rock'em Sock'em Robot set virtually, and the outcome determines what happens in the country. Like, the longer it's prolonged, the effects are going to be on the same populations that you're purporting to care about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's well, what can I add to that? That is the point. I mean, it's those poor millions of people. They're obviously going to be, the ones that are here in Europe already. We don't seem to be letting too many in here. Are going to be in a very distressed condition for years. ideally, much of Ukraine has already been destroyed, as you say. Let's not destroy the rest of the country for a pissing match with Vladimir Putin.
Do you think? I mean, you said it earlier that domestic, foreign policy is domestic politics. You said it. Correct. You said it better than that. But do you think the reason we're not having those kinds of conversations publicly is in part because of the political implications for Joe Biden in a year where, as you alluded to, his domestic agenda has completely failed, and the only little bright spot he's gotten in terms of a kind of a little bit of a poll uptick is around the approval of this war, his behavior in this context?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly, and it's just like in the previous, during the Trump administration, the Democratic Party and the left were inclined to suspend disbelief and sign on for the whole, Putin put Trump in power narrative, which was nonsense. So there is part of that. This is our, there's certainly a belief this is our only hope of maybe clawing back a few votes and, not doing so badly in the election. So that has to be part of the sort of thinking, I think.
Do you think this would have happened? And this is a spicy question. Do you think that this would have happened if Trump were president, given his relationship with Putin and his criticism of NATO and NATO expansion, and them, quote unquote, not pulling their own weight in terms of funding and such?
Well, I don't see why not. I mean, Trump doesn't do anything that isn't about Trump. So if Trump were thought that it would get him political dividends to take an aggressive position towards Putin, he certainly would. I mean, don't forget, for all the rhetoric about Trump being in Putin's pocket and Trump saying the occasional kind word about Putin, I mean, he had a very anti-Putin policy on the ground. I mean, in terms of, further defense spending, about, urging NATO to spend more, to confront Russia and all that. I doubt it. No, I really don't think it would have been that much different. If Putin had been determined for his own reasons to do what he's done, take the position he's done, I'd say Trump would have looked at the polls and looked at his Twitter feed and probably carried on. There was no sign that he had any real sort of deep analytic. And remember, the people he had around him, don't just say if Trump were president, if John Bolton was still national security advisor, we'd have been nuking Moscow by now. So
I mean, that is the presumption, right? Everyone, even people on the left are kind of acknowledging that, well, it is nice to have a cool head, not to be worried about Trump's finger on the nuclear button, as it were. I am curious I do sometimes want there to be a little bit of thoughtfulness analytically about how, if in any way, Trump might have been different in ways that are worse or better. Like, I'm curious, we talk about Trump being an oligarch. We talk about Trump having these ties to Russia. Would we have had this kind of unprecedented leveraging of the central banks to sanction Putin in this way, given his own conflicts? Or I'm just curious whether you've given any thought to that sort of a thing.
Yeah, well, one thing to remember about Trump is he was a very weak president in terms of, I'll give you an example. Trump, in the waning days, actually after the election, Trump was persuaded, he wanted as his legacy that the US, he'd gotten the US out of Afghanistan. And actually there was a, presidential decision memorandum, which he signed, that, to have all US troops out of Afghanistan by December 31st, 2021, by midnight. And then, it was reported, it wasn't published, but it was reported around Washington that he'd done this, and all hell broke loose. And the McConnell was calling him and raging at him, and the Joint Chiefs were complaining about this. Oh, we can't leave Afghanistan, can't abandon our allies, and he was talked out of it, and he dropped the idea. So if we'd had someone who was in the Pentagon at the time who was in favor of that policy, actually, it helped write the memorandum, said to me, he said, the thing you have to understand is there was a Trump presidency, there was never a Trump administration. In other words, he never got control, particularly the Pentagon. So if Trump were in office faced with the present situation, I don't think he would have found it possible to take anything, a radical course different from what, the bureaucracy, for want of a better word, and everything that goes around it, the blob, the consensus wants to see happen.
How comforting that the national security state is the one true constant.
Oh, absolutely. Our rule is now and forever. Yeah.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.